Donnie and Dolly. The team is supported by ableauctions.ca. Closing your business? We can help.
Thursday and all of today's guests, including Chris Johnston from The Athletic, TSN. Standing by, brought to you by the Vancouver Giants, celebrating anniversary 25 tomorrow. The G-Men face off against Portland at the LEC. Puck drops 7 p.m. Also get your tickets now for the annual Teddy Bear Toss game happening next Saturday at the LEC. Giants taking on Victoria that night. Visit VancouverGiants.com for details and ticket info. Chris Johnston covers the NHL for The Athletic and TSN. He's been on the show before, friend of the show, and he joins us again now. Chris, thanks for doing this, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, boys. How are you?
Very well. You've written an article on the Olympic ice surface in Milan, smaller than NHL facilities. What, about somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 foot or shorter in length. Chris, how the heck does this happen?
I think there's a lot of people trying to figure that out this week, to be honest. And, you know, what's interesting about this story is, depending on who you ask, some people have known about this for some time. Certainly, I know Hockey Canada was on the case here as far back as the summer in terms of their people recognizing this is what was going to happen. But my sense is there were people at the top of the league that weren't aware of this until kind of this surfaced as a story this week. And so, you know, I don't know in the end how much it really matters. I mean, it's kind of emblematic, I think, of what's been a non-smooth preparation for these Olympics in Milan. And you know, obviously the NHL and the NHL players, they're guests at the Olympics, that they're not in charge of, you know, building these arenas and having the facilities in place. But, you know, I think they were a little surprised to learn that was the case. And you know, at this point, quite honestly, the biggest concern of all is just seeing if that arena project gets completed on time. I think there's a certain amount of hope and expectation it will, but you know, we're 2 months out right now and we can't say for sure that that's going to happen.
Yeah, for people who are of my vintage, we all remember 1976 in Montreal, and the Olympic Stadium was never complete. I don't think it's completed as we speak right now. What about the overall building itself, Chris? What are you hearing?
Well, it's come along, you know, a lot in the last few months. I mean, the first time I became sort of aware this is an issue is basically 2 years ago at this time. The league had a board of governors meeting. It was down in Seattle near you guys there. And Gary Bettman said, this is a problem. They haven't even started building it yet. So, I mean, the rink's only been under construction for less than 2 years. You know, obviously, I think in Italy, there was issues even back in 2006 when the games were in Torino. You know, I think that the Italian construction workers work on their own schedules. Anyone who's traveled in that country, it's just maybe a little different than other places. I mean, let's face it, part of the charm is the Olympics. You go to different countries, but maybe everything doesn't work in the same way you're used to. And so, you know, definitely there's been a lot of progress since the summertime. I know that some real alarm bells went up in August when the NHL had staff in Milan. At that time, they had a media tour there, but also did some touring of the facilities. And at that time, there was no road done, no practice facility started. You know, big parts of the building, you know, incomplete. It's come a while since then, but still, it's not totally done. And you know, the biggest issue is you're supposed to play 33 games during the Olympics between the men's and the women's tournament in an 18-day window. Basically, two games a day, we'll call it on average. You know, they haven't yet played a game in the building. And so usually you'd want the facility done. You want to do a test event and then obviously make any corrections or fix anything that isn't working. And there's just the window's getting a little tight here.
Wow.
What Canadian players are going to be on that ice, Chris? Oh, we got a couple of kids from Vancouver, Macklin Celebrini and Connor Bedard. What are you thinking? Like, what's your thoughts on these two making that Canadian team?
Well, they've been, for me, two of the stories of the league in this season, you know, from a big picture perspective. You know, the fact they've, you know, right up at the top of the scoring list, you know, really now for several weeks, you know, that they've forced the hand, I think, of the decision makers to really consider bringing them both. You know, they were each invited to the Olympic orientation camp in August in Calgary. At that point in time, I was there on the ground. You know, the sense was it's nice to have them around. They were the two youngest men's players invited. I think we all know in 2030 they're going to be huge parts of the Olympic team for Canada. There was some benefit there, and there was a thought that, okay, maybe one of them, you know, sneaks in and you know, is the 13th forward or 14th forward, wherever you have it. Well, fast forward to now, and you know, the Olympic management staff is meeting this weekend, and really to ostensibly get down to their final choices. And I think both these guys have to be in the mix. It's just, I understand that it means leaving off potentially, if you put them both on, you're leaving off a player maybe who's won a Stanley Cup or was one of the Four Nations players last year. But just with how well they played, I think they're making the decision really difficult.
Chris, you're an insider. The Canucks are in the news. Sherwood, they sent the memo out. What are you hearing on Vancouver and Sherwood and anything else you can think of Canucks related when it comes to trades?
Well, certainly the memo achieved one of its aims. I think that there's been a lot of discussion that's run through the Canucks front office since they did that fact. And obviously when you send something like this out, it's almost like having a garage sale or something. You get varying levels of interest, right? One of your neighbors pops by just to see what you have. Another one might be haggling with you on the price on something. And so, I think at this point, it does sound as though it's gotten a little quieter. I would say in the last couple of days, but I don't know how much to read into that just yet. I mean, the reality, Kiefer Sherwood is the main attraction, I think, for among the players that Canucks were thinking of when they sent that memo out. I don't see how, whether they trade him on December 4th or January 4th, or maybe it ends up being March 4th, just before the trade deadline. I think that if you're the Canucks, you're probably not going to see the price drop by waiting. I mean, obviously the only risk would be, and this the same with any player, if he gets injured or something that might impact things that way. But his start has been so good. He's such a unique player in the marketplace. Only making $1.5 million on the cap is huge this year, because you can't double retain on trades with salaries the way you have in the past. And so this player just has immense value, I think, longer term, maybe for someone who wants to sign him, but for a contending team, fitting him into their current cap picture, he's everything you could want. So that's a long way of saying, I think the Canucks can be patient. And so, they've got a good sense, teams like the Dallas Stars, like the Minnesota Wild. I know you guys have been talking about this, Montreal Canadiens. There's others that have interest here, but I don't know that anyone's stepping up and really forcing the issue and trying to get a deal done in a short window here. But we'll see what happens with injuries elsewhere and if that changes here in the near future.
Are you guys trying to get every former Canuck into Toronto in the lineup there? Dakota Joshua, you got Troy Stetcher, Chris Tanev. What's going on? Give us updates on all three of those guys.
Well, Stetcher's been a real, blessing for the Leafs, because they're in a tough spot. They've been down Tanev and Brandon Carlo, two of their right shot defensemen, for some time now. Neither appears to be anywhere close to returning. So Stetcher, the Leafs were basically in an emergency situation when they claimed him off waivers from Edmonton. And, all credit to him. He's been great, and he's playing over 20 minutes a night right now. And the team is actually, seen its fortunes change. It hasn't been a very good start, I'm sure you've noticed, for the Leafs overall this season. But in the last week or two, they've started to play better hockey and started winning some games, and he's been a part of that. So, I don't know how long it lasts, but very likable guys, I'm sure just very open and plain spoken about how he feels like he's playing for his career right now, that he doesn't know, if this doesn't work out, what's left for him in the NHL. So, it's easy to relate to someone like that, and he's done incredibly well. I think Chris Tanev, the 6-year signing they made before last season, he was probably low-key the Leafs MVP last year. A big part of the defensive improvements that team made, and they got all the way to Game 7 of the second round. I know it ended in familiar fashion for the Leafs, but that was a successful season by most measurements, and I think Tanev was a huge part of that. Maybe conversely, part of the reason they struggled this year is he's had two separate now injury absences, just hasn't been able to play much, and so they miss him. Joshua was a slow start, and maybe not what they were hoping for at first. He was even a healthy scratch there recently, but all of a sudden, he scored a couple goals, and the Leafs bottom six is kind of falling into place, and I think he's filling the role that they had envisioned for him, sort of on a third line. That's tough to play against. It obviously gets in on the forecheck and is a physical line, and he has the attributes to do that. So maybe some signs here in the last week or 10 days that he's finding a little bit more comfort and a spot in this lineup.
I thought you were going to go through the entire Leafs roster for a second. You can't do that in Vancouver, Chris. But I will ask you one more question. I heard this earlier today on Vancouver radio. What's happened to Austin Matthews' shot? Is this injury related?
I think it's a fair question. If it is or not, he's very private when it comes to his health, and he's had last year he had a lot of setbacks. This year he did miss a short window of time. It was an unrelated injury to what kept him out last season. It hasn't looked as dangerous, although I will say it's another thing that's come on. I mean, maybe when I'm saying why things weren't going great for the Leafs, it's probably because some players were either injured or out of the lineup or not playing well, and then all of a sudden it's all coming together. But, he scored a goal in Pittsburgh on Saturday with sort of a vintage looking shot. But there are some signs in that NHL Edge data that he's not firing it in the way he used to. I'm not hitting all the alarm bells just yet because, I do think that, he's still of an age where I think it might be a brief thing rather than a trend heading in a specific direction. But certainly he hasn't been quite as dangerous in that area in the last year and a half.
Can't believe he's a 28. Chris, above and beyond, as always, all the best, my friend. Thanks for this.
Okay, guys, be well.